The valley is a ghost of its former self. If you stood on the ridge today, you would see a landscape bleached of its color, a patchwork of gray dust and brittle stalks that snap like dry bone under the wind. But right in the center of that desolation sits a single, stubborn rectangle of emerald green. It is the farm of a man they tried to bury in fines and laughter, while the industrial giants watch their multi-million-dollar investments wither into the dirt. This one patch of earth is singing with life. It makes no sense to the men in suits, but the earth has a long memory. If you want to hear how the underdog fought the machine and won, subscribe to Beyond the Fields and stay for the whole story. The air is heavy with the scent of a storm that refused to come, and the silence in the valley has become a physical weight. The silence did not happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping theft that took years to notice. In the old days, the mornings in this valley were loud. You couldn't sit on your porch without the constant, rhythmic hum of 1,000 wings. There were honeybees, heavy with nectar, bumping against the screen doors. There were the iridescent blue orchard bees and the clumsy bumblebees that lived in the hollows of the fence posts. You took it for granted, the way a man takes his own heartbeat for granted. It was just the sound of the world working. Then the sound began to fray at the edges. First, the songbirds went quiet. The meadowlarks that used to perch on the barbed wire vanished, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. Farmers would look up from their tractors, wiping the sweat from their brows, and realize they hadn't heard a single chirp all morning. Then the bees started to falter. It began with the honey. Local keepers noticed the hives were getting lighter. The wax felt brittle. They found piles of dead workers at the entrance of the boxes, their tiny bodies curled into tight balls of charcoal. People blamed the weather. They blamed the changing winds, or they blamed some mysterious sickness from overseas. Nobody wanted to look at the dirt beneath their boots. This valley had been a garden for 3 generations, but we were starting to treat it like a factory floor. We wanted more. We wanted perfectly straight rows without a single blade of grass out of place. We wanted every leaf to be a uniform shade of green, untouched by the bite of a single insect. We got what we asked for. The insects left, and when they left, they took the soul of the valley with them. I remember walking out into my own orchard and realizing the blossoms were just hanging there, beautiful and useless. There was no one to visit them. No one to carry the life from one branch to the next. It was like a giant clock where someone had reached in and pulled out a tiny essential gear. The whole machine was still there, but the hands had stopped moving. The old-timers talked about the great drought of the 30s, but this was different. The rain still fell occasionally, but the earth felt dead even when it was wet. You could smell the chemicals in the runoff, a sharp metallic tang that bit at the back of your throat. We had traded the messy, loud, vibrant life of the soil for the sterile order of a laboratory. The silence grew until it was all we could hear. It sat in the valleys and echoed off the hillsides. A farm without sound is a terrifying thing. It's a cemetery that hasn't been marked yet. We watched our neighbors struggle, their eyes growing hollow as they stared at fields that refused to yield. The local co-op, once a place of laughter and tall tales, became a room of hushed whispers and desperate ledgers. Everyone was waiting for a miracle, but no one was looking at the ground. We had forgotten that the land is a living thing, and you cannot poison your partner and expect her to keep providing. The birds were the first to go, but the bees were the ones that broke our hearts. Without them, the fruit didn't set, the clover didn't seed. The cycle of life had been cut, and we were all just standing there, holding the severed ends of the rope, wondering why we were falling. Into that growing silence stepped the men in the crisp white shirts and the polished leather shoes. They arrived in black SUVs that looked like ink blots against the dusty horizon. These were the messengers of the great chemical promise. They didn't talk about the weather or the ancestors. They talked about efficiency, yield per acre, and the ultimate victory over nature. They called themselves specialists, but we knew them as the harvesters of debt. They walked onto our porches with tablets and spreadsheets, showing us graphs that went up and up, promising a future where we didn't have to worry about pests or weeds ever again. The lead executive was a man named Sterling, a fellow who looked like he'd never had dirt under his fingernails in his entire life. He spoke with a voice like honey-coated gravel, telling us that the reason we were failing was because we were too sentimental. He said the old ways were a drag on the economy. He offered us a miracle in a plastic jug. "Use our seeds," he said. "Use our sprays. We will kill everything that isn't profit." The desperate farmers listened. When you're staring at a foreclosure notice, a silver-tongued devil starts to sound like an angel. One by one, the families signed the contracts. They turned their fields into scorched earth zones. They sprayed until the wild roses in the ditches shriveled and turned black. They sprayed until the monarchs ceased their migration through our trees. The executives told them this was progress. They said the yellow haze hanging over the valley was the smell of money. But for every gallon of poison they poured out, the debt grew. The chemicals weren't free, and neither were the specialized seeds that only worked if you bought the company's entire cocktail of fertilizers. The land started to look like a lunar landscape. It was clean, all right, not a weed in sight, but the soil lost its smell. It no longer had that rich, chocolatey aroma of healthy decay. It smelled like wet concrete and vinegar. The executives didn't care. They were already looking at the next valley, the next group of desperate men. They viewed the earth as a lemon to be squeezed until the rind was dry. They laughed at the idea of natural balance. "Balance doesn't show up on a quarterly report," Sterling would say during the town hall meetings. "Only output matters." They convinced the community that anyone who wasn't using the full chemical suite was a threat to the valley's biosecurity. They made it a moral failing to let a thistle grow. They created a culture of fear where we policed each other's fence lines, looking for any sign of untidiness. The pressure was immense. If you didn't spray, you were an outcast. You were the reason the pest pressure remained. They turned neighbor against neighbor, all while they sat in their air-conditioned offices back in the city, collecting interest on the loans they'd forced us to take. It was a sophisticated kind of robbery. They weren't stealing our cattle. They were stealing the future of our dirt. And the most heartbreaking part was watching the younger generation of farmers buy into it. They didn't remember the bees. They didn't remember the way the air used to shimmer with life. To them, the chemical drum was the only way to farm. They looked at the corporate logo as a shield, never realizing it was a brand. Then there was Elias. Elias was a man who had been farming the same 80 acres since he was big enough to hold a hoe. When the corporate men came to his door, he didn't even let them off the porch. He told them he didn't need a chemist to tell him how to talk to his land. While the rest of the valley went clean, Elias went wild. He stopped mowing his perimeter. He stopped spraying his back 40. He let the goldenrod take over the hillsides, and he let the milkweed choke the drainage ditches. To the rest of us, it looked like he'd given up. His farm became an eyesore of brambles, tall grasses, and what the town council called disorderly vegetation. They started calling him the man of the weeds. At the Sunday market, folks would walk a wide circle around him. They joked that his farm was the headquarters for every pest in the county. The mockery was sharp and constant. The town council, prodded by the corporate lawyers who wanted a total monopoly on the local land, started hitting him with fines. They cited him for fire hazards, for noxious weed violations, and for being a nuisance to the public. Elias just took the papers, folded them neatly, and put them in his pocket. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He just kept planting things that didn't have a market value: wildflowers, native shrubs, and thickets of clover. He spent his evenings sitting on his porch, watching his mess grow. The local paper ran an editorial calling him a Luddite and a threat to the modern agricultural economy. His own cousins stopped inviting him to dinner. They were embarrassed by the way his property looked next to their sterile, laser-leveled fields. It was a war of nerves. The council raised his taxes, and the fines piled up until they were nearly the value of the land itself. They wanted to break him. They wanted to make an example of what happens when you defy the corporate order. But Elias had a secret. He wasn't just letting it grow. He was curated a sanctuary. He was building an island in a sea of poison. He knew that the land was holding its breath, and he was the only one giving it a place to exhale. Every time a neighbor sprayed a new round of neurotoxins, Elias would go out and plant more shelter. He became a hermit, a shadow in the tall grass. Kids would dare each other to run onto his property, calling it the jungle. They didn't see the life returning in the shadows. They didn't see the way the soil under those weeds was staying moist and cool, while their father's fields were baking into cracked clay. Elias was the villain in our story for a long time. We blamed him for the odd beetle we found or the fungus on our corn. It was easier to blame the man who was different than to admit we were killing the world around us. We stood on the steps of the courthouse and watched him walk by, a man alone, surrounded by the laughter of the progressive farmers who were one bad harvest away from losing everything. The year of the Great Silence was the one that changed everything. It was a spring like no other. The trees erupted in blossoms, a sea of white and pink that should have been the start of a legendary harvest. But as the days turned into weeks, cold realization settled over the valley. The blossoms weren't turning. They were simply drying up and falling to the ground like confetti at a funeral. On the industrial farms, the air was dead. Not a buzz, not a hum. The corporate sprays had worked too well. They had killed the pests, but they had also finished off the last of the local pollinators. Without the bees, the millions of dollars of high-tech seed were just expensive birdseed sitting in the dirt. Panic set in. The executives tried to sell us mechanical pollination drones, tiny, expensive machines that were supposed to do the work of the bees. They failed. They were too slow, too fragile, and they couldn't reach the heart of the flowers. That was the day the wind shifted. A scout from the agricultural board was driving past Elias's farm when he heard it. He stopped his truck, thinking his engine was failing. But the sound wasn't coming from his motor. It was coming from the woods. It was a roar, a deep, rhythmic vibration that shook the very air. He stepped out and walked toward Elias's fence line. There in the weeds was the miracle. Thousands, no, millions, of bees were swarming. They were everywhere. The wild meadows Elias had nurtured had become the only survival bunker for every pollinator left in 3 counties. While our fields were silent graveyards, his farm was a riot of sound. The bees had found the only place where the air didn't burn their lungs and the nectar wasn't laced with death. And then they began to move. Like a living golden tide, the bees started to spill out from Elias's sanctuary. But they didn't go far into the poisoned lands. They stayed where the forage was safe. They stayed on the edges of his property, working his crops with a ferocity we had never seen. The turning point was a morning in June. We all gathered at the fence line, staring in disbelief. Our orchards were bare, the fruit stunted and shriveled. But over the fence on the weed farm, the branches were already heavy. The clover was thick and the air was alive. The man of the weeds wasn't a failure. He was the only one who still had a future. The corporate men tried to claim he was hoarding the pollinators. They actually talked about suing him for the theft of ecosystem services. But the rest of us just stood there in the dust, watching the bees dance in the only green place left on Earth. It was the day the silent wings returned, but they only returned to the man who had kept a light on for them in the dark. The harvest that year was the day of reckoning. The industrial farms, for all their chemicals and high-priced consultants, produced nothing but dust and debt. The corn stayed knee-high and turned yellow before it could even tassel. The orchards were a total loss. The corporate executives packed up their black SUVs and disappeared overnight, leaving the farmers with the bills and the scorched earth. But Elias had the crop of a lifetime. His wild farm produced fruit so heavy it snapped the branches. His honey was clear and dark, tasting of 1,000 different wildflowers. When he brought his wagon into town, the same people who had mocked him stood in silence. They were hungry, and he had the only food in the valley. The town council didn't talk about fines anymore. They stood on his porch and begged him for seeds. They begged him for advice. The debt of arrogance was being paid in full. The farmers realized that the weeds were actually the immune system of the earth, and they had spent decades trying to destroy it. Elias didn't gloat, he didn't charge double, he just told them thing. The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land, and she doesn't like being told what to do by men in suits. The climax came when the bank tried to foreclose on a neighbor's property. Elias walked into the bank with a bag of cash, the proceeds from his miracle harvest, and bought the note. He didn't take the land for himself. He gave it back to the family under one condition. They let the fence rows go wild. He began a quiet revolution, 1 acre at a time. He showed us that the profit promised by the chemicals was a lie, a mirage that disappeared when the environment finally broke. The real profit was in the resilience of a healthy system. We watched him work his fields, his back straight, surrounded by the very insects we had been taught to fear. The weeds were now seen for what they were, a sanctuary, a nursery, and a bridge to a time when the earth was whole. The valley began to change. People stopped spraying. They started planting native flowers. They began to listen to the hum of the wings again. The corporate greed had been a fever, and Elias was the cold water that finally broke it. The arrogance of thinking we could outsmart millions of years of evolution had nearly starved us. We were harvesting the bitter fruit of our own pride, while Elias was harvesting the sweetness of his patience. It was a hard lesson, written in the dirt and the empty bank accounts of men who thought they were masters of nature. The valley is slowly healing now. It isn't as neat as it used to be. There are more briars, more unmown edges, and more tangled thickets of elderberry and sumac. But the sound has returned. That glorious, heavy hum fills the air from dawn until dusk, a reminder that the world is alive and working. Elias still sits on his porch in the evenings, watching the swallows dive for the insects rising from his tall grass. He never became a millionaire, but he has something better. He has the respect of the soil. He taught us that nature isn't an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be understood. The corporate men are gone, seeking new victims in distant places, but their legacy of dust remains as a warning. We learned that when you kill the small things, the big things eventually fall too. The earth remembers every drop of poison and every seed of kindness. It waits, it watches, and in the end, it always rewards the man who has the courage to let things go wild. The land is patient, and for those who listen, it always provides a way back home. Thank you for walking the fields with us today. Until next time, keep your hands in the dirt and your heart in the land.